Two Russian oil tankers are burning off the Turkish coast inside of NATO-controlled waters. Black smoke from the tankers Kyiv and Virat now marks a single point of failure for the Kremlin. These ships have been a financial lifeline for Russia's war machine. Both were hit within 30 minutes of each other in the waters that are patrolled by NATO navies. The strikes came earlier today on Saturday, November 29th, in the Black Sea corridor. With these fires, Russia's ability to fund large-scale aggression starts to fracture. Money that normally turns into missiles and glide bombs is now burning on the surface of the sea. And inside of Moscow, this Saturday will be remembered as the day that the cash tap caught fire. When Russian oil burns in NATO waters, the Kremlin's budget burns with it. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kyiv Post and a national security advisor. For Russia, the situation just took a very dangerous turn. Ukraine now is going after Russia's only means of generating more revenue. And we'll dig into that, exactly what's going on and why it's so important. Because once you see it, you'll understand why today for Russia is such a truly bad day. But before we go on, I ask your favor with just one thing. Please help me out by getting the message, the truth of what is happening here in Ukraine and what's really happening in Russia to the world. As you know, Ukraine right now is in very intense and very serious negotiations. And unfortunately, many still believe the myth that Russia is strong, that Russia will win, and that Ukraine should take a bad deal. Nothing could be further from the truth. Ukraine today is proving that Russia is far weaker, much more of a paper tiger than anyone had ever believed. So help us get the truth to the world of what's really happening. You can help us very simply by liking this video, subscribing to this channel, and considering becoming a channel member today. Now, you can also please leave your comments below and share this video with others. I thank you for doing these things. It does help us to get Ukraine's message to the world. So let's dive into it. Let's look at what's really going on here on the ground. And let's start with what happened here last night in Ukraine. You can be quite certain nobody here in Kyiv, in the capital, got any sleep. Russia, in a multi-hour attack, launched over 632 strike assets. Now, what's incredible about this attack was it was one of the largest of the war, and it went on for hours. The explosion after explosion, the machine gun fire, and the anti-air going off. But the important part is this. Of those 632 strike assets, 577 of them were downed or suppressed. That includes 12 cruise missiles that were intercepted, 4 ballistic missiles that were shot down, 2 guided missiles that were destroyed, and 1 Kinjal missile that was neutralized. However, not all of these targets were struck. In fact, the well-known multicolored Comfort Town, a working-class neighborhood on the left bank of Kyiv, was hit. Now, you might wonder, thanks to this attack, striking Comfort Town, the multicolored town in the left bank, does that change the war? Does that bring a victory closer to Russia? No, it does not. Because today, the war is no longer be fought only on the territory of Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is taking the war onto Russia's territory. The attack on the Shadow Fleet, it is very important because this is triggering a cascading financial shock for the Russian state. It struck precisely at the point where the oil money pipeline has now been severed. Now that the Shadow Fleet is no longer off limits, nothing guarantees that Russia can freely export oil. Once export flows are choked, the war budget begins to bleed out day after day. The covert Shadow Fleet that once hid Moscow's exports is now burning, uninsured and exposed. The location of these strikes reshapes the strategic map of the Black Sea and the choke points. The pattern reveals that Russia is losing control of the Black Sea, but it is also losing control of its own economy. A superpower that cannot protect its tankers is a superpower on borrowed time. The attacks unfolded near the strategic waters that lead towards the Bosphorus Straits. This narrow corridor is the single most critical choke point for Russia's seaborne oil exports. The tanker Kyiv was hit roughly 45 kilometers, 28 miles, from the Turkish coast. The tanker Virat was struck shortly thereafter, and it was about 55 kilometers or 35 miles off the same shore in the same corridor. Now, both these vessels sailed under flags of convenience, hiding their real Russian-linked ownership. Turkey, a NATO member, controls this maritime gate between the Black Sea and the global markets. Strikes this close to NATO territory signal tremendous confidence in both targeting and in intelligence. But there's something else here that's very important. Russia now has realized something. Any sustained blockage here would strangle Russia's export economy faster than any sanctions could hope to. In fact, in practice, this becomes a kinetic enforcement tool to enforce the Western sanctions. But reports today confirm that these tankers were definitely part of the notorious Russian shadow fleet. This shadow fleet exists to bypass Western sanctions and international safety regulations. Many of these ships are aging hulls that should have already been scrapped long ago. The crews routinely disable the transponders to vanish from civilian and commercial tracking systems. The Kairos was sailing towards Novorossiysk to load up on a new cargo of crude oil. The Vrat was holding offshore, waiting for fresh orders and routing instructions. Both ships are now burned out wrecks, and they are sitting there waiting for someone to pick them up. They've in fact become hazardous to navigation. This incident shows that the shadow fleet is no longer a ghost on the radar screens. It has become a slow, soft target for modern, long-range drone warfare. The lack of legitimate insurance turns these losses into a direct financial wound. Western syndicates like Lloyd's of London would normally cover catastrophic hull losses. Shadow vessels operate outside the global financial safety net and outside of trusted insurers. They rely on obscure entities that cannot cover multi-hundred-million-dollar claims. Russia now has to absorb the full cost of the destroyed tankers on its own books. The real losses climb into the hundreds of millions of dollars for each destroyed vessel. Replacing specialized tankers under sanctions is almost impossible to do at the scale that Moscow requires. Each tanker lost becomes a permanent cut in Russia's export and revenue capacity. However, the story gets even better. It's more than just tankers that got struck, because almost simultaneously, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium terminal at Novorossiysk was struck. This terminal functions as the beating heart of Russia's southern oil export routes. And this attack, it went after the massive buoy that's used to load the supertankers in deep waters, far from the visible shoreline. The consortium has now said that repairing it is going to be impossible. The damage is described as significant and critical for continued terminal activity. This is not a minor disruption. It is an intentional interdiction of seaborne trade. The terminal handles nearly 1% of the entire global oil supply. A stoppage at Novorossiysk sends an immediate shockwave through Russia's federal budget. The Kremlin relies on these petrodollars to pay its soldiers, to build armored vehicles, to build more shells. Loadings were suspended as soon as the drone strike was carried out, and the tankers were ordered to leave the loading area and clear the danger zone. This interruption derails export schedules for days and possibly weeks ahead. Every day of delay drains Moscow of millions of dollars in lost revenue. The resulting backlog of ships will create a logistical trap in the Black Sea. Buyers in India and China will now see Russian deliveries as unreliable and risky. That unreliability forces Russia to sell oil at even steeper discounts just to keep the few buyers that it still has left. Now, a historical precedent helps us measure the scale of this defeat at sea. The moment echoes the humiliation that Russia saw in 1905 in the Battle of Tsushima. In that battle, a rising Asian power destroyed the Russian Imperial Navy in open waters. The defeat exposed rot, incompetence, and arrogance at the very core of the Tsarist regime. Today, Ukraine is dismantling Russia's fleet without even possessing a blue water navy. Inexpensive, agile drones are destroying capital ships and tankers that the Russians had once thought were untouchable. Russia still claims the status of a great naval power, but today its navy has to hide in its own ports. The Black Sea Fleet is now largely confined, fearful of sailing into contested waters, as in 1905. The loss of the sea control has signaled a broader decay inside of the state. In 1905, Russia lost its fleet. In 2025, it is losing its future. The timing of this economic blow could not be at a more damaging time for the Kremlin, because Vladimir Putin, he just signed the federal budget for 2026. That budget allocates roughly 30% of all state spending directly to the war. Healthcare and education, they're getting cuts. The regime is cannibalizing its own population to feed the frontline machine. The leadership is wagering the country's future on a war that it clearly can no longer afford. Budget projections rely on high oil prices, uninterrupted export volumes. But today, that assumption can no longer be held, because today Russia sees that it cannot necessarily sell its oil abroad. Between the sanctions, the fact that today Ukraine is attacking the oil industry, what can Russia do? If oil revenue collapses, the entire 2026 spending plan it turns into political fiction. Economic pain is already spreading through ordinary Russian households. Internal data from Sberbank shows a sharp collapse in real food spending. Spending on basic food has dropped significantly compared to the previous year. Families are now moving to cheaper, lower quality, higher calorie foods in order to survive this winter. Poverty levels are approaching those that Russia has not seen since the 1990s. Inflation has steadily eroded wages, especially amongst those who work in urban areas, those that work in the industrial base. The working class today in Russia is suffering because of their government. The government is reaching for desperate measures to conceal the depth of this crisis. Deputy Sergei Mironov has proposed a temporary price freeze on core food products. The proposal would freeze the price of foods from December 1st to January 10th. Then this narrow window is thought to help the Russian families to celebrate New Year's, so they have enough money to survive the holiday. But price freezes are a classic sign of a failing command-style economy. They reliably produce shortages, hoarding, and black markets, and that's what the Russian government probably realizes. When a government turns to price freezes, it is silently admitting that control is slipping. The destruction of the Kairos and the Vira exposes a structural weakness in Russia's power. Russia is unable to guarantee the safety of its own merchant fleet in its nearby waters. But the Black Sea Fleet has effectively lost uncontested control over the sea lanes. Insurers will flee the region or raise premiums to levels that are effectively unpayable. Foreign captains will hesitate to dock at Russian ports, such as Novorossiysk, because they saw what happened to other ships that have been docked there. In practice, this acts as an economic blockade on Russia's southern export flank. The risk of sailing towards Russia now outweighs the expected profits. This is a self-imposed isolation of a petrostate that has turned its coast into a war zone. While the economy burns the sea, Russia's nuclear shield is also visibly crumbling. Reports confirm a massive explosion at the Yasny intercontinental missile base. A toxic purple mushroom was seen coming up. Today, the war is very clearly divided into two fronts, and they feed upon each other. One front is kinetic, on the ground in the Donbass and along the contact line. The other front is economic, fought in ports, terminals, and underwater pipelines. On this November weekend, the economic front has suffered a visible, cascading defeat for Russia. Today is the day that Russia lost its wallet of the seas. The following days will show how badly it has been able to blunt the Russian sword on land. The facade of Russian power is cracking at the same time on the battlefield and in the balance sheets. The burning tankers now serve as floating beacons of approaching systemic collapse. Putin is running out of ships, out of money, and out of exits. Thank you for watching. Please like this video. Please subscribe to this channel. And consider becoming a channel member today. Please do help us to get this message to more people by, at the end of this video, there's an option to click the next video. By clicking it, that shows the algorithms that our content is worth getting to others. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.